right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. We are going to shift gears just a bit and move into the world of, I would say, not yet large organizations, small and rapidly growing organizations. And we have just a dynamic and incredibly thoughtful panel today of participants who've seen this not only in their current role, but in prior positions as well. And so I thought the best way to get started, and perhaps we'll start on the end and we'll work our way this way, was to hear from you individually about your careers, but also tell us a little bit about the ventures that you're working on now. And this is a panel about innovation, but also about these volatile times that we're in. And so I thought we'd start with the innovation before we get to the volatility. So if you can tell us a bit about the innovative space that you're in right now.
Yes, sir. I'm Jason Quinn, CFO and CEO of Vendor. The innovative space that we sort of sit in is vendors trying to recreate how software is bought and sold. And we're doing that. We started sort of as a negotiation as a service enterprise, which is helping companies that are mostly SMB and mid-market buy software in a fast way, in a fair way, in a risk-free way. And now what we're trying to do is we also work with sellers to combine the two from a platform perspective. And what that allows us to do, most people, how do you combat inflation in this economic environment? How do you save costs? Well, you can do that with Vendor. Vendor can bring software to your company, the right software, because our community and the data platform that we built better understands what everyone else is using and how that can better inform your decision, better inform your price, and better inform where you may have gaps. So that's part of the innovation component. Prior to that, helped DraftKings go public, so joined them when I was sort of a little bit young in 2015. Went through some really turbulent times. But what DraftKings' mission was about is how to change the game within the game. And so that's a whole gaming market that's sort of created within the US. And then prior to that was Vistaprint. And Vistaprint at that point in time, most of the time, and that's about another Boston-based company, a startup in the 90s. And that company decided to take what you usually went to a kiosk. Now you can do an online template, buy promotional products online. So spent most of the last 2 decades finding Boston-based companies, although I lived in Europe for quite a bit, building up a European division, looking for awesome innovations and bringing them as far as I could to public and beyond. So it's been a great venture, and Vendor, I believe, is the next one.
Excellent. Don?
Hello, my name is Don Halstead. I'm the CFO of Ionic Materials. It's a company located in Woburn that is focused on advanced polymer sciences in 2 particular applications. One application is layers and materials to go into electric batteries to make them far safer and control thermal runaway. The other application is as a material, as a layer that goes into the manufacturing of components to make antennas, primarily to go into applications like cell phones that enable the much higher bandwidth that's necessary to fully utilize 5G and eventually 6G. So both of the products are tapping into what I think are 2 monstrous trends in the markets. One is the explosion of electric vehicles and the demand for electric vehicle batteries. And so we're talking about a component that makes them safer. And the second is being able to do high bandwidth communications and to enable that, and that's what the second application is. The second application will be the first one that comes to market. We are just completed about 10 years in total of development. The last 4 years have been working on manufacturing. It's a very difficult product to manufacture, which is actually a very, very good thing. And it's a reason why there's only one manufacturer, actually there's 2 manufacturers in the world right now who can make this product, and there's an enormous demand for it. So it's got a lot of potential. My background before, I've been doing this for about 1.5 years. My background before that is I've spent 42 years in operational finance in a variety of companies. The last 20 years or so have been in CFO positions for both public companies, as well as now 3 venture-backed private companies. So I actually spent my first 17 years working for IBM, so when I was listening to the speakers in the last session, I could resonate with the things that you frankly have the luxury to work on when you've got a huge company with a momentum. I've moved now to working in smaller companies where things happen at light speed and are very rapid, and I like it, but it's very, very different, particularly when things get volatile.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm Ashley Wall. I'm the CFO of TeachTown. TeachTown's an ed tech company that develops curriculum for children with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities. So we sell to school districts into the special education classroom. We have both online curriculum as well as physical goods, reading materials, manipulative kits, et cetera. And so when the world turned digital, even more digital than we were before with COVID, it was a huge tailwind for our organization, and we grew rapidly, as well as any other ed tech companies in here with ESSER funds has allowed our school districts to actually be funded for once in an adequate way. And so we've been reaping the reward from that. My background, I started my career out at EY, and I somehow was lucky enough to get in this incredible technology company when they were just ramping called LegalZoom. Got my first itch of technology, startup, hyper growth. And the CFO at the time all he did was he was a serial kind of CFO. He'd come in, clean up the accounting, the finance, all that kind of stuff, get it ready to sell, go take it public, and then go on to the next. I was like, that's cool, I want to do that, and that's kind of what I've been doing, and I'm having so much fun since. I've worked at LegalZoom, TripAdvisor, JobCase, which is a local Boston company, and now TeachTown.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So you can see we've got quite a range of industries represented and experience here, and then we're going to kind of bring this to this macro event that is affecting all of us in different ways within that. And so Jason, I wanted to start with you. You mentioned that y'all are in this period of kind of hyper growth, incredibly innovative and exciting. But you also mentioned something that I think many of us are trying to do, which is we're really trying to balance this innovation portfolio or innovation activities with prudence. So really thinking about how can we grow market share or build our portfolio, increase margins, while also thinking about inflation and controlling cost and myriad other concerns. How are you thinking about this, and in what ways should the broader community here today think about how they can assist their organization to really balance these concerns?
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult situation. I think in general, just framing for a minute, like it's the highest cost of capital that most of us have seen in the last 15 years. In the startup world, you're thinking about what your cash burn looks like, when is that potentially going to run out, and how much do I really want to hit the gas on this great market opportunity that I see in front of us, surrounded by a lot of people that have come together that really believe in this mission. And as CFO, I found it's actually a pretty big challenge. But one of the things that we will do is a prudent and sort of like capital allocation exercise, which is let's lay out all the specific aspects of what we really want to invest in, get really focused on the things that we feel like we can build momentum for, seed enough for this year, but also in the next couple years, because we do think about it in the sense of a hockey stick. But I think the prior panel also said it too. I was like, oh man, they got it from me, but not at all. I probably took it from them. Is we plan to fail. So I think we sort of think about it in the sense of in quarter to 6 months increments, if we're seeing certain signals, how to sort of really pull it back so you're not in a situation where you are potentially doing some layoffs. What we're trying to do is constantly look at it on a quarterly basis and then continue to escalate and invest into the company. So we go for the hockey stick play, but then we sort of have a B, C, D scenario depending on what we're seeing at that point in time. One of the biggest things that we also in several is that there's a competitive threat that you also have to work toward and sort of understand defensible moats and try to look for those to build. And so that's a constant conversation that's happening within the company at a very rapid pace, and seeding those as quickly as possible to try to build up defensible moats so you can sort of have line of sight and predictability and durable revenue for the long term.
Great, thank you. And I know we'll want to dig in more into really thinking about what those look like, on the ground as far as tactics. Yeah. But related, Dawn, you had told me that the CFO role actually just really is transformed in volatile times. Can you, walk us through in what ways is it transformed, and also, what things can we do to really prepare for this new role that we're taking on in this new environment?
Yeah, and I think as a backdrop to that, I do think the CFO role in smaller companies is different than it is in bigger companies. If I think about how I divide up my day, I spend only a small sliver of my day focusing on actually managing the finance function. I'm lucky I've got a very talented, very small accounting team, and I've got a wickedly smart FP&A manager and modeler. So I'm able to interact with them fairly directly. My time is spent in partnership with my CEO and with our functional managers and the key people in the teams. And I think one of the roles a CFO has to have is being a chief communicator internally and being able to translate some of the concepts that we hold as being intuitive, but which other holds as being arcane, like managing cash flow, and turning that into something that means something for people that they can translate into their day-to-day decisions they're making. Further to that, what we try to do is integrate the tools that we develop that help people make their decisions on the line, whether it's building out a new manufacturing line or setting up a new advanced laboratory, and have the tools they use to make those decisions be the ones that integrate with the finance and have my wickedly smart FP&A manager serve as a shared resource between us. When that happens, you end up with communications that are clear, you end up with people not keeping secrets, and you have a foundation for the communications. And I find that part of the role and its counterpart, which is communicating to the board, to me is a much more critical part of my role in the smaller company than it was when I was the CFO at 3Com and had 500 people in finance. So it's interesting, and frankly, it's what I like.
Absolutely. Actually, you and I actually talked about this similar, which is that you view part of your responsibility, particularly right now, is really interpreting the levers that affect your business and communicating that to your team. And so can you kind of walk us through how you think about how you're balancing those strategies with the prudence that your colleagues have mentioned here?
Yeah, so I would say theme right now in the pattern is cash burn, cash flow. When you're in a startup, that's like your lifeline, and so it's something that you're constantly wanting to monitor, and you have to understand the levers. And there's always top line growth, but you also have to know if that's not going the direction you need, what levers can I pull from an OpEx perspective or margin perspective to slow the burn. And so I think it's important as finance professionals, you go in and you really understand the finance and the business well enough, work with your business partners to understand those levers. At one of my previous organizations, SEM was a very big spend on our P&L, and so we understood really well our first-time value, that return on that CAC to drive out LTV. But in times where Google would change their algorithm, we would be spending 2x what we normally would spend to acquire a customer. All right, we had to know what levers we could pull. What are we willing to kind of risk from a short-term perspective to keep our eye on that long-term, or is it so much of a burn, we actually have to pull down on our customer acquisition so that we have enough cash to hang out through the rest of that. And usually Google will always change back, or we're part of an A/B test or something like that. But we need to ride those waves by using those levers.
Great. And so when you think about, I know that many of y'all are already done with your 2023 planning, which may be an anomaly, maybe
Dawn
par for the.
Are.
Yeah.
That's why we're up here all relaxed.
Exactly, and we love that. But as just naturally, you were just talking about things that you were monitoring. So how did you approach 2023 planning? Thinking about, what are you looking at? What are you adjusting? Given that there are certain things that we know, that Jason mentioned, that we know are changing and that we know that are going to be different for the foreseeable future. But there's also a lot that we're still, taking in new signals and new information as other firms adjust. So can you kind of walk us through how you thought about making adjustments for the 2023 and how you were going to continue to monitor that as you move forward?
Yeah, I can start. I think what's hard in a startup is it's hard to get that historical trend because there's so many things changing every single year. It's hard to pinpoint. And so I think it really comes down to those key assumptions in understanding those big fluctuations that has happened in the past to know how it drives the future. Have those set KPIs. I think someone in a previous panel, I have 15 KPIs I look at every single week. We do the same, and we know what those KPIs are, and if they start trending in a different direction, we know to start pulling on some of those levers that I was talking about previously. Another one is just having a great network, like the folks in here and the CFO Leadership Council, plug for Jack, and asking those folks, a big assumption that we had to understand was the cost of living adjustment. Inflation's sky high. What are other companies doing? We want to make sure we're being competitive so we don't lose top talent. We also want to make sure that we're not overpaying and reducing our adjusted EBITDA. So that's another way that we kind of assess as the 2023 budget process.
Absolutely. Don?
And I think if I add a little bit to that, when I joined Ionic Materials, I put in place a discipline I've used, a tool I've used for a long time, which is I believe in projecting 2 to 5 years out by quarter in a fair amount of detail, because once you build a model, it becomes fairly easy to maintain it and roll it forward. So when it came time to take a look at 2023, like you, we did not have a long range of actuals. However, we had a history of prior projections. So we were able to start asking ourselves, what are the differences going to be? The first and most obvious is the salary differences. Over the past year, we have been very careful to monitor the salaries of critical skills like senior technicians, like mid-range process engineers that have seen spikes in their pay and react to that. So we then ended up saying what we need to do this year is both put in a metric for an average merit increase and also hold back a pool that is for specific spot awards, not awards, but spot increases in order to react in a defensive way to what's happening to the markets. We then took a look at what are the other areas. We are an intensive electricity user. We have dry rooms, we have glove boxes, we have vent hoods in our labs. So we knew what was going to be happening to the Eversource rates. Secondly, we're now on an effort to try to find alternative sources of the electricity. We actually took a look at our space and said, you know what, we can sublet part of our space as a way of reducing footprints. So we took a look at things that could actually, because the only way you can go after occupancy cost is changing footprint in a big way. So we took a look very discreetly at the things that were likely to be impacted by the trends we saw and said, what's the leverage? One of our arguments for getting our plan approved by our board, which was on Tuesday of this week, was if you prove it now, we start working on the problems now. Now we can use 13 and a half months to try to solve 2023.
Great, thank you.
You've got yours to listen.
So vendors at a place where we have a lot of opportunity where we can grow. So one of the things we're doing is we sort of looked at about 10 opportunities of growth. We've narrowed them down to about 3 to 5 that we want to do. And we're essentially doing 3 plans. The plan of go slow, really extend your cash burn into plus 5 years or something. We're in a really good spot where we raised right as I was joining. That was the first thing I did. But sort of the other piece is we're going to go big. We're going to go big on the top 5 things that we really feel are things that we can put the pedal down. And the second plan in between is if we're not seeing the right signals, then we can slow down very quickly to sort of continue in a trajectory that makes sense from a burn multiples perspective, which is every ARR dollar that we add, sort of you burn at least $1 in cash, sort of keeping the company in a stable place. And then if we're moving down to that second plan after we hit the gas, then we're going to sort of reassess the other 5 things that we put at the lower part of the list, or relearn what we may have tripped up on or didn't do right the first time. That list could change and we should pivot. Again, competitive understanding, market landscape, if things turn in a way that we sort of want to go in a different direction, but that's sort of how we're going at it.
Great. One of the strengths of a startup, but also all the challenge at all times, is really recruiting top talent to this nascent venture, and a lot of opportunity, but also a lot of uncertainty. And certainly if you compound that with the uncertainty that we see more broadly, that can lead some additional hesitancy in folks to join a startup. Certainly during the early pandemic, when there was economic uncertainty, what we saw was that highly skilled workers really fled to the safety of large traditional companies. How are you thinking about that when you think about really recruiting that next wave and continuing to build the team necessary to implement those innovations?
This is, for me, where the CFO has to play a very large role in recruiting for a company, especially if you're at a startup. I try to sort of provide an understanding of what the company does, but actually push back to the candidate sort of like a framework. And to me, it's all about research. It's research the market opportunity that vendors in today and how we think about it, but do your own research. Understand what our company's doing, our financial, our momentum, our trajectory, and then assess the team members that we sort of have. And team members, including the board that we have, the investor pool that we sort of have. And when you look at across that, that's how I make the decision to join a company. would even spend the most I've spent is a year thinking about a specific industry before I've joined it. And do your diligence. So because when you do join a startup, it never works out the way it's supposed to. But the goal is that the trend is going up and to the right. And if you have the fortitude to say that, and grit and perseverance to go after an opportunity and you believe in it, then you can add a lot of value to the company because you've thought about it holistically. And while you're in it, it's very hard to pull yourself back and think about it at a macro level again.
Great, thank you. John, did you?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of points to that. If you're a small company, and we currently have between 50 and 60 people in the company, resources are critically important. And if you lose a critical resource, it can be very difficult to fill. So in my mind, there's both a defensive and an offensive part to this. The defensive part is you want to build enough trust among the employees that somebody is watching their back and will take care of them, and they're not going to end up getting left behind. That comes to timely merit increases, good communications, the increases to the jobs that are suddenly spiking in terms of demand and returns. If people think that the management is actually keeping an eye on it, it tends to give them a degree of comfort. I think having communications to the team about where the company's going and being honest about the trajectory is what gets them over the discomfort of the small companies. And there, frankly, are some people who don't get over that and still end up leaving because they want a higher degree of security. One of the other things that we did, and again, this is still on the defensive side, about a year ago, is we put a program in place where every employee in the company has some stock options in the company. They may not be a whole lot if you're an entry-level technician, but it's something. It's a stake in the company. And that has a very, very powerful sort of emotional attachment that the people have. On the offensive side, when we have to fill people in, we have a fairly aggressive employee referral process, which in positions like technician positions, you'd be surprised how often technicians are part of a community that know each other. Somebody gets them in and they can earn $4,000 for doing that, which is frankly no more than we pay to get a placement out of one of the agencies. When it comes to the medium to the engineers, what you have to have is evangelists who can sell what your company's doing in the language that the engineers will talk. So it ultimately is the technical drivers of the business are the ones who sell people on that. If you have any turnover in the upper level positions, it's kind of a different mix if it's up in the executive levels. So in my mind, you got to look at it and you got to keep a constant monitoring. My closest colleague in the business is probably the HR director. It's just absolutely critical to keeping the business going. Yeah. Ashley?
No, I 100% agree. I think what was very interesting, I think is in the earlier session where we were all doing the exercises, the individual, I think it's Chris Johnson asked, what's the biggest asset of everyone's business, and everyone's in people. And so I think it's so critical that we get the right people and we retain.
Cash is kind of important too.
Well, that's right. That's part of the reason you got to keep them. But yes. So like for us, I think finding out what really motivates the candidate during the interview process, I try to find out early, and then when they get through to the end, I kind of reinforce what is important to them. So if it's mission, okay, I reinforce mission. If it's career growth, I reinforce career growth. So then that I'm catering to what really drives and motivates them to be able to get them on staff. Every person we hire, whether it's in my department or not, I reach out on LinkedIn, say, welcome to Teach Town. I'm so excited for you to join. And just having that communication right off the bat gets them even more excited that they made the right choice. Because if you think about your time switching jobs, like it's a bit nervous, like there's a lot of nerves going from telling your employer you're leaving to joining a new company. There's a lot of uncertainty. To give some certainty to that future employee, just, I guess it adds more favor to the employer themselves.
Absolutely, I love that. It's the small things that we would want.
Yeah,
that creates community. What do you do with the community once you've hired them, right? You brought them on, especially right now. There's a lot of concerns about layoffs and other changes. And so how are you keeping morale high and communicating and being transparent with the team?
Yeah, I think to Dawn's point earlier, there's this balance you have to have with transparency versus being over-transparent, because if you're over-transparent, people might not like what it looks like. And so like I tend to like be a bit more over transparent with the high performers. So I try to find those high performers and like involve them, bring them into the fold, have them be part of the solution. That gives them that bigger visibility and that better visibility so that they're not in the dark and that they do retain with us. Because again, to the asset point, like these are the folks that we want to keep happy on staff because of their knowledge, their dedication, their loyalty. And so to do that, we need to involve them in the whole process.
Great, thank you. Another kind of key stakeholder that is, a key partner in this process is your investors within this. And so, Jason, how should CFOs really think about leveraging those partners during this time and thinking about kind of keeping them up to date, but also using them to stay abreast of the changes?
Yeah. I talk to them very often, especially board members, investors, and borrow their operating groups as well. I just find that they have such a different lens than what you're sort of in at that moment. And for me, the goal is to share what's happening with the company, what do I see in the market conditions, both from the competitive landscape as well as just in general capital markets. And I'm asking them what they're seeing. And they're obviously investing in companies, they're investing in adjacencies, and they're doing a ton of research on these companies. They're doing a bunch of customer interviews all the time. And so the more I can build that relationship, the more they share, and the more I'm willing to share about how the market develops. And there's obviously a trust built in there that you sort of like stay within the bubble, because at the end of the day, they really do want you to be successful. And some people not as transparent because they think it's competitive or things of that nature. I haven't found that usually really selective about the different investors that are on the cap table and the ones that are working with you over decades to make you successful and you're making them successful. So I'm very open and transparent.
Don?
Yeah, I think in Ionic Materials, the situation is we have about 65% of our cap table is actually represented on our board in terms of the investors. We also have investors that have been with the company for 5, 7, and 9 years, depending upon what round they came in with. So what I personally find fairly easy is the communication with the really big ones, because it's all part of the board level communications. It's the communication with the next tier that at times can be a challenge, because somebody's been invested in the company for 5 or 7 years and haven't seen, the revenue's always the next year out. And what are you're going to do? So we have to establish a process where we have a quarterly update to them. There's about a half a dozen who want calls, and then once a year we do an investor meeting where we actually have them in and give them a view of it. And in that case, that's mostly information out. When I deal with the ones that are on the board, it's very much a two-way information. One of the things I've used them for is, particularly when I first started, and I was building some of the base models that we were going to be using, I use them to help me proof and check the models and offer suggestions on actual models I was putting in place, because they have technical folks on their team that have seen 50 or 100 companies. And it's a resource to be tapped into and take advantage of. And nobody minds being asked to share their expertise.
The only thing I would add is twofold. A lot of PE firms have like these kind of experts or gurus, so it's always nice to check in with them. I know with Bain, like they have this individual that all he does is like help all the sales organizations. So we like pull him in whenever we need to, as well as PE firms usually have like specific like law firms, like accountants, et cetera, that they tend to use. And so that kind of makes your job a bit more efficient, because you don't have to go and vet a bunch of these outside third-party consultants. You can just utilize their recommended vendors, which I think is also helpful.
Great, thank you. You guys mentioned, and I just want to double click on it because it's been there in your responses, that the CFO role is really evolving to this really cross-functional role. And that's always been the case in a startup environment, but it's particularly so right now. What are the ways that you are being that bridge, and what are like in tactical ways or tools that you use to really facilitate that? So when you're having those conversations, whether it be with your team, your employees, or with the investors or others, that you are sending that consistent message, and you are that bridge, I think, as Dawn had mentioned earlier.
First?
Sure. They told me earlier they were just going to give all this stuff. No. So one of the things that I was particularly focused on is customer success. Our customer success organization has a managed service component. It also breaks down what you usually have as a customer success manager, as well as a some other functions that we have in the organization, but it's all about the customer journey. And so as sort of we expand, what I like about being a startup head of finance in any capacity is that you also play a heavy operational role. And part of that is setting the tone at the leadership level. There's a lot of people that are growing up in their career in a startup, as well as you're bringing in lifeblood that have seen it and maybe have done it before, and you have to make that culture work. So that's like number one, get the right mindset within that portion of the company. Number two is really set very specific goals and expectations of what success looks like for that part of the organization. And I think CFOs, we can really say this is what it looks like, and this is the KPI we're looking at. The third is where you're seeing specific talent needs, whether bringing them up, coaching them up, or actually going down to a tactical level and actually, I think doing some of the work yourself. I think just goes a long way. And so those are the three aspects. And what we're trying to do is transform our particular customer journey, because we've grown exponentially so quickly, and now we're expanding into different segments of the market. So we need to sort of like revolve that. And so that's what the CFO, that's what I'm doing right now. That's not traditional from a finance perspective.
I think what I'd add to that is a very critical role the CFO plays in communications. After any major discussion or issue, and I'm sure everybody in this room has the same phenomena, I get the drop-ins to my office.
Yes.
So the head of our battery program will drop in and said, did I understand correctly that the board said X? And I say, yeah, wait a minute. And you put it in context, and you try to take the comment that they heard and put it in the broader context that you generally have as the CFO. But in order to be effective with that, there has to be a belief, a justifiable belief on everybody's part, that you as the CFO have a lot of integrity, and you're not telling different stories to different people. And in that case, when they ask you for an interpretation, they can start to understand it within the context of what's going on. And if there's an issue with a strategy, it ought to be taken up in a strategy session, not by sort of a different argument to one person versus another person. And if you're viewed as being impartial and having a lot of integrity, then you'll be given a lot of opportunities, more than you probably want, to be able to be communicating that. But I think it's hugely effective to having a consistent message going from you and the CEO down into the organization, and also up to the board, because you also get the calls from the board members on the same thing. Is off the record, I want to talk about something. Those are actually great opportunities, because that means somebody's willing to trust you to understand what they're doing, because they take a risk by asking the question, and it gives you an opportunity to help get a coordinated message.
Yeah, I would agree. I think like one of the things I was surprised about coming into like the head of finance CFO role was how much finance don't actually do. It's more like this kind of cross-functional like communication. And I do think, Don, to your point, when you have that integrity, you're almost like the kind of the facts person or the data person. And so you have all these different folks coming up that are your business partners, trying to either understand the decisions that were made at the board level or within the exec level, but also to bounce ideas off and like help negotiate or find how to work with this other function or vice versa. Because they don't want to go to the CEO, that's their boss, right? So they have to find someone else. But you also have to have that like open communication and dialogue with the CEO. So you're kind of like this person in the middle that's trying to navigate all these cross-functional communications.
Absolutely. I think especially as what I've heard from you guys over and over again is especially in these times where there is a lot, and also that your employees or your other stakeholders may have other signals or misinformation, or just more broadly in the misunderstanding, I would say more accurately. And so you're there on the ground and really communicating that consistent message and this consistent set of facts. I do want to open it up to the room, because I'm sure there are many questions for you guys as well. So if you want to raise your hand.
I actually have one.
Absolutely.
So, I was actually at a CEO conference a couple of weeks ago, and one of the, thanks. Sorry, I have a big mouth. I assumed everyone could hear me. So I was at a CEO conference a couple of weeks ago, and on stage, one of the CEOs, he referred to the CFO as the cash flow officer. And his belief was that right now the greatest thing a CFO can do is simply monitor cash flows. And before I had a chance to roll my eyes and said, what a silly idea, he got applause from all the other CEOs in the room. So I think there's something there. But I'm wondering, as CFOs, what do you think of that kind of mindset from the boss. Are you seeing something similar?
Let me take a first pass at that. If I were to think about what is the one existential threat to my business right now, it would be running out of cash in an environment that is unfriendly to financing. Because if that happens, you're dead. You shut down. That's the existential threat. And any CEO worth their salt in a small company knows that. So the question, I don't think, is should you be focused on cash flow, because the obvious answer is yes. The question is, how do you make that productive? How do you actually turn it around so you take that focus and make it productive? And one of the things we do is, one, those are metrics that we report on to our senior team so that they understand what it is, but we actually translate it into how will issues manifest themselves in the result? What role does inventory planning play? If we have our sales guys going out and starting to talk and establishing new relations with customers, and they're going to have a period of 6 months where a customer is going to be ordering before we get a sales agreement in place, well, you know what? How about pay in advance? You know, day sales outstanding. When I tell them, look, right now we're expecting at the, in a certain period, you're going to have X millions of dollars tied up in accounts inventory, accounts receivable, and inventory. How do you improve that? Because from a tactical standpoint, that's still $1 of cash. It really has to do with the efficiency of the operations. You also go to the point that if you're expecting supply chain interruptions, for instance, you take a look at the product, and if you have a product that can generate a 40% gross margin, and 5% of the cost of that product has a potential for supply chain interruption, you ought to quadruple your safety stock. Because even though it appears to be cash up front you're doing right now, what you're doing is you're de-risking the fact that the other 95% of the cost could be stuck in incomplete work in process inventory, which is truly unproductive. So I think in terms of managing, use the cash as a clarion call to then talk about what are the metrics that actually people can do that end up improving it. And that's where you leverage the communications and you leverage the tools. I feel strongly about that one.
I can ask one. Since this is the innovation panel, and you just mentioned operational efficiency being critical, can any of you or all of you speak on what are you doing in terms of automation, whether it's invoice to cash or procure to pay, AR side or AP side? Are you using any of the latest and greatest, whether it's RPA or more cognitive technologies? Thank you.
So the vendor has a pretty unique advantage on this, is that we basically can see all of whatever our competition does, exactly what they do. A lot of companies probably in this room, what they have for tech stack, when they buy it, what works, what doesn't work. So what I'm doing with the company is just going by function to understand what their tech stack is today, where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, to aggressively go after automation. And in a growth phase, what that does is that doesn't take the head out of the company. What it does is it saves the next head that we need to hire. And it also makes everyone really effective, especially in the sales and go-to-market organizations, as they're sort of, for example, seeing it's a company called Ambition. Just put that in. We see all the activities that's going on with sales, so it's a coaching moment for them to understand their activities to basically hit their quota. Particularly like what you're asking around the finance side of it. So shameless plug a little bit here, but what vendor is able to do is it helps on the intake to procure side of things. And then what else is we're still on QuickBooks because we grew so quickly, so we're moving towards a Sage or something like that, which is really good. And then we'll start sort of like moving into different things like a Brex or a Ramp of that nature to help sort of a lot of the tracking that they've been able to sort of like quickly spin up. So I think that combination usually really works for finance in more of a startup perspective. And I'm happy to take it offline. I mean, depending on where you are in your procurement cycle, where you are in your company, there is pretty specific signals around what your tech stack should look like in the finance realm. Although we probably have one of the more messier tech stacks, and you'd see in the nice fancy sales and marketing side of the house. But happy to take that offline.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, when you go into a startup, usually there's not a finance. They're on QuickBooks. They have a bookkeeper, but they don't have an actual finance department. Teachtown was founder-led, and then Bain came in, and we were using Mass 500. I don't know if anyone here remembers Mass 500. We retired it at LegalZoom 10 years ago because it was old then, and we're still using it. And so coming in, everyone's doing everything manual. There's no integrations, and so that was one of the first things me and the CEO did was like look at our whole lack of tech stack and say, what does great look like, and what are the like roadmaps to get there? Because there's a lot of chicken and eggs. We were using Classic on Salesforce up until like 6 months ago, and now we're doing Lightning, and we have to revamp Lightning to integrate with Sage, and we had no financial reporting tools, so everything was in Excel and like 100 meg files. So how do we get financial reporting insights and KPI dashboards? So, but we were lucky that I guess lucky that we were able to kind of paint what we really want the tech stack to look like, because nothing was really there, and start executing against it. The hardest part is we all knew what good and great looked like, and it takes time, and you have to give give yourself forgiveness that it's going to take time and it's going to be messy until you get it all implemented.
Absolutely.
And if I can answer that quickly, at our company, I'm going to give you a two-part answer. At our company, prior to my joining, they'd made the conversion to an ERP system, an integrated ERP system, because they knew we were going to have a multi-stage manufacturing process. So the part that was probably the most sensitive to financial statements and whatnot is internal operations is pretty much automated, and we're reasonably disciplined in using it. When it comes to automating things like customers' collections and things like that, we've done absolutely nothing. But the reason is very simple. We right now only are going to have 3 part numbers and 6 customers. You don't need a lot of automation to do that. I look forward to the day when the customer list has grown to the point where automation will be a benefit. Of course, the customers we're talking about are Fortune 500 customers. So it is both good and a risk when you're concentrated in the customers. But it's not a place to spend a lot of time on the automation.
So generally, when you're looking at areas you can invest in from a go-to-market perspective, there are a series of metrics you can use to track the efficiency of that and where you should be prioritizing your investments. It's a lot harder to do when you're thinking about it from an engineering standpoint. So as you're working with your engineering leadership and they're thinking about coming to you with, how should we prioritize, where do we prioritize? And in some cases, these are projects that may not have any sort of revenue associated with them for several years. How do you think about measuring the return on those investment bets that you're making?
When we look at it at Ionic, which is very much research intensive, I actually don't use a return on investment metric. I use a cycle time and efficiency metric. And one of the questions we look at on almost every piece of significant lab equipment we look at is what's the cost and what's the cycle time to use an outsourced operation to perform the test, particularly when you're doing testing of various things, or you're doing trial laminations of things, or trial production of things. What's the trade-off between using contracting and doing it in-house from an expertise standpoint and from a cycle standpoint? Because what those feed into is the potential for the whole project to be successful on that. All that's done with an overall envelope of the funds that we have. The other thing we've done, one of the other challenges small companies can have, is it's very difficult for a small company to be ISO compliant. You got to go through a fairly lengthy process to do that. But if you can leverage contractors in some of the process, you can take advantage of the ISO umbrella that they already provide. And so in some cases, it's part of your growth path is to leverage contractors, and then over time, bring the capabilities inside as you can afford to do it.
One thing I would say is I think it comes back to what your kind of key focuses are as a company. At one of my previous organizations, it was always top line growth, and the engineers were always focused on those projects. Even though there was significant cost savings in other areas that would actually probably be higher than that top line growth, it didn't matter. Top line growth is the focus, but still keep those project lists, because it's another lever, as I was talking about earlier. When COVID hit, okay, top line growth went away. We looked at one of those IT projects that we raising our hand to get some engineers to focus on, and we switched to that. It was around right-sizing our database for AWS spend, and we were able to save the organization like 30% on, actually 50% on our AWS cost, but it just wasn't the right priority for the organization at the time. So I think that's hard sometimes for our engineering team. They're like, this is like a really shiny, cool object and project to work on, but if it's not aligned with the corporate goals, then it's not the right project to work on at that point in time.
A related question, which is, I think you mentioned this earlier, is, we think about moving to digitization. Many folks are remote, are hybrid, and that brings advantages. One of which is that in so doing is perhaps you can shrink your blueprint, your footprint. So how do you guys think about the role of digitization, not only in kind of in automating certain tasks, but also in how you engage with your team? And when is the right time to really reevaluate footprint and capital expenditure?
So we're a remote-first company. We started about 3.5 years ago, so we grew through COVID. We use technology to basically run the entire company. I would say the couple things that being remote first is we try to make sure that we're hiring at a very high bar, and if it's not an exceptional hire, we've actually flipped a little bit to focusing on our 2 office footprints at the moment. And I think a startup sort of goes through various phases. It hits infrastructure or building blocks and pain points, and you sort of need to say, okay, well, I can continue either to hire remote, or I need to pause for a second. There's some infrastructure plays. I actually want to continue to hire to go after that growth, but it's so much easier if they kind of sat next to each other. They can train each other a little bit better. They can get up to speed. There's dynamics that's going on, and that's where Vendor is today. But it will go back once we sort of fix some of those growing pains, and it's going to go back into more of a global footprint. So I do think we're just going to continually flex. I really enjoy the fact that we have Zoom. We do all of our all hands there. The other thing we put in place is each month, if we're doing transformational change in a certain part of the department, we're bringing the leaders and key people that are working on those projects together once a month to spend a couple days together, because you could just get so much more rapid discussions that sort of clog the system. But then 2 or 3 weeks, sort of in a remote environment, they can go off and really work, and then you got to bring everybody back together again.
Yeah, I would add to that, from an exec perspective, I think it's key to have the execs come and be on site for at least on a quarterly basis, because I think that there's better communication, but also creates that camaraderie that is so important from an exec perspective. On our end, we actually increased our footprint. We have a warehouse, and then we've grown so much with COVID and the ESSER funds that we actually had to increase our square footage from a warehouse perspective. But we're still a remote organization. And it is this, we were always remote, but I think that the challenge is trying to understand that culture in a remote way, and not being able to kind of have that water cooler talk, et cetera. And I think that's been a challenge even within this organization that has always been remote. So I can only imagine how hard it is for folks who have been physically in person switching to remote.
And how are you, you mentioned seeing through or behind corners, people checking in when they hear something. How do you adjust that when it is remote first?
Anyone watch Game of Thrones? You have your spiders, right? You have your folks that are embedded in the organization that will surface that information. I think is really important, because no one's going to come up and knock on, or virtually knock on the CFO or CEO's door saying, hey, I'm not very happy about this, although there are those employees. So I think you have to have those people who have their ear to the ground to kind of see what is happening, because you don't get to overhear that at the water cooler anymore. It's kind of hard to get that information from the organization.
And our organization, I think, is a little different, because about 85% of the people in our company are working with glove boxes, scanning electron microscopes, the dry rooms, or new manufacturing processes. You can't do that remote unless you happen to have a scanning electric microscope at your house. But what we have encouraged is that people can use a hybrid approach, because with everybody there's a point where a day every 2 weeks or a day a week can be worked remotely very, very productively on that. The other thing is there are some of the functions like the admin functions where you can have a higher percentage. What I do, at least with my team, is we're very clear on the meetings and sessions where we really want it to be in person, because you need to have the exchange. We get our executive team together, we want them in person to get the right exchange. And if you're clear in the communications and you set it out ahead of time, people work their schedules around it. And it allows you to be both flexible but still try to get it done. But it's an ongoing balance. And I think every quarter that balance is going to change a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, just really shortly, really quick, as we wrap up, what advice do you have for those in the room that want to make the transition to a more startup environment, dynamic and volatile and innovative, all that it is? And so just really quickly here, what are your advice?
I said earlier, it's do your research, but recognize, like Mike Tyson said, he said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. Just come in with that mindset. And once you do, but just have the fortitude. It's a lot of fun when you do it, and you'll be able to break through it.
I'd also say a venture-backed company is a company where you can end up doing a very good job, but still having the company fail. That's actually not a failure. That is a huge, huge learning opportunity you have. And what might actually then surprise you is that the board members that worked with you on the prior company may be exactly the ones that recommend you to go into another company. It's you move in companies the way you move in divisions in great big companies. So it's a very different environment. Things move a lot faster. You got to be comfortable with that, comfortable with the volatility. You have the ability to have an impact in a very, very quick turnaround. Yeah. Cycle times are very fast. And if you like that kind of environment, there's just nothing better.
Yeah, it becomes addicting actually. Like once you do a startup and you enjoy it, like you can't go to a large company. You can't go back. But I agree. Like it's fast paced. You are forced to grow. You're forced to learn, and you learn at such a fast pace. You're like, okay, well, what's next? Because I can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. So it's constantly stretching your boundaries, and then be ready for founders and other folks that might not have that finance acumen that everyone here brings as a strength. There's a lot of education that goes along with not only the founders, but all the way to the folks that are coming in at the entry level. That there's a lot of education. It's what is finance? What is EBITDA? All this kind of stuff. And so that takes up a lot of time that you don't anticipate if you come from a larger organization where that finance acumen's already there.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.